Spotted Radio.
And what's the work these days for you?
Well, the work that I did then was what we would call clinical, which is people would come in, they would pay a fee, they would be interviewed by a psychiatrist, they'd have some interviews, then they would have a very high dose LSD session, just one, and some follow-up, and then we would notice what had happened and what they came in for and how they improved. We also did a creativity study where we had senior scientists coming in with problems they couldn't solve, and with the help of a lower dose of LSD, I think we had 48 problems and 44 solutions. That all ended when the government stopped all research, and I picked it up again many years later when I started to what are called now microdoses, or very, very tiny doses of psychedelics that have a totally different set of effects. So the answer to that one is a long answer. Many of the people who are listening to us have had probably a psychedelic experience in high school or later, where their world really opened up in ways they'd never imagined. Their visual world became incredibly bright and powerful. They began to see everything as energy, not just as form and matter. They also may have lost their own identity and become really part of whatever whatever everything is. Michael Pollan says it was as if his identity was being poured all over the landscape like a coat of paint. And you don't come out of that seeing the world the same way. It's a little bit, there's a World War I song that said, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? This is because so many American soldiers were rural, small towns, and suddenly they were in Europe, and they were in Paris, and the world it's all based on letting go of your personal identity and having what's called a mystical experience, an experience of oneness, an experience of unity, an experience of identifying with all life. Big shifts.
Yeah.
Microdosing does none of that. Absolutely none of that. It's kind of, like on your radio dial, when you go from FM to AM, AM isn't like little FM. It's its own universe. Microdosing and allows you to do whatever you normally do a little easier, a little more comfortably. There's a book out by Alec Baldwin called A Really Good Day, and that's one of the definitions of someone microdosing. They say, gee, I had a really good day. And one of the reports I've gotten said it this way. It says, I had a really good day. I got some work done that I hadn't wanted to do. I was nice to people in the office, even that person who didn't deserve it. After work, at the gym, I noticed I did one more set of reps. Then I completely forgot I'd taken a microdose. So
right.
It's not, the universe doesn't shatter. It just, maybe it smiles a little bit. I mean, when someone says, I want a drink, you don't hand them a bottle of vodka. That's a dose problem. So,
right.
Microdoses are a 10th or a 20th of what people now call a recreational dose, which is, in LSD terms, recreation is about 100 micrograms. Micrograms are a millionth of a gram, so we're talking very little. A microdose is 7 to 12 micrograms, meaning it's about a tenth of that. And with psilocybin, we're talking mushrooms. A trip, a fairly serious trip, is 3 to 5 grams of mushroom. That's one of those shake your universe trips. A microdose is a tenth of a gram to maybe 4/10 of a gram. And the range is big because different species of mushrooms have different amounts of psilocybin in them, and different mushrooms in the same batch have different amounts. And so when people are microdosing, they learn what's best for them, and it's in that range. Now, I should also say really early on, microdoses are not taken every day. Underline, not taken every day. What I've recommended for the past 10 years when people ask is take it on day 1, take 2 days away from it, and then take another dose if you're planning to work with yourself for some time.
Yeah, high doses.
No pun intended there.
I think one of my questions is maybe a bit high level, but no pun intended there either. I'm curious about how you think of a trip and what you think is happening there.
Okay. When you're having a high dose, one of the things that people notice is they want to lie down because walking around gets to be tricky. What over the years people have suggested, and it's true in all the research, people then will be given eye shades so they can go inside, and they'll also be given music. And the kind of music they're given turns out to be very important, because as you come into the inner psychedelic trip, the music serves as a guide. So the sad music will bring on sadness, and vast orchestral music will bring on a sense of expansion. And the only genuine rule for music is, if possible, no lyrics, because your brain is going way faster than words. And when people begin to do that, they usually will report a long period of just beautiful scenes, beautiful images or beautiful geometrics, fractals, kind of exploding fountains of light. Just gorgeous visual imagery. And, you know, it's one of the reasons when you go to a concert and there's a fantastic light show, they're trying to reproduce a little bit of what you're getting from psychedelics. That feeling of amazement in kind of visual. But it's all with your eyes closed. And then what happens is you begin to detach from your identity, from yourself. You know, my Jim Fadiman-ness becomes less important. There's an eye, there's a sense of somebody's observing. But it isn't specifically, you know, this guy who has this bad ankle from a car accident. That guy becomes amazing. And you begin to explore the kinds of experiences that you only read about in poetry and mystical literature. So people will say, I remembered my own birth, or I felt the whole creation of the world, or even people saying, you know, I could go back to the beginning of time and be part of the Big Bang. Now, it isn't clear what they're really experiencing, but what they're reporting is a feeling beyond their own identity. And there's a term called transpersonal, or through or beyond the person, where these experiences clearly aren't about you. They're about, they're kind of in the universe. You're feeling the way the whole universe is behaving. It's kind of like, you go down the ocean, and the waves are individual, but not for long. And they have much more of an identity with the whole ocean. So what you're getting with the high trip is remembering that you're part of the ocean. Now again, when that all occurs, and if you're in a safe and comfortable setting, that can be very beautiful. If you're in an unsafe and uncomfortable setting, it can be terrifying. And one of the examples is if you're in a safe setting and you have this feeling that you're going to die, and in some sense, your ego is not going to die, but it's going to become less important. So it says, you're going to die, you're going to die. And you are sitting in this, in this room, and you take off these headphones, you sit up, and you say, I'm going to die. And you have a guide, which is very important in high doses. You have a guide or a friend, and they say, just go with it. And you say, but I'm going to die. And I say, oh, yeah, I know, I heard what you said. It's all right. Just let me hold your hand. And inside of you, what you're feeling is, well, I thought I was going to die, but my friend seems to know what he's doing. I remember I've taken a drug. Maybe I'll just lie down and see what happens. And it turns out that when you get to the other side of that, it's in a sense of enormous peace and gratitude. People describe the universal energy, and I've heard it over and over, and I see it in classic texts as well, as it's closer to love than anything else. It's not negative, it's not cold, it's kind of accepting. So that's a very brief run through what most people say is one of the most important experiences of their whole lives. Does that remind you of anything?
Yeah, it does. It does.
If you've lived, say, in Indiana, which is a pretty flat piece of country, and then they blindfold you and they take you to the edge of the Grand Canyon. They let you down on top of a glacier. You're aware that your prior world in Indiana was really small, and that there's an amazingly large and graphically different possibilities in this world. So you then are brought back, blindfolded again, brought back to Indiana, and if there's no one in Indiana who's ever been to the Grand Canyon or been on a glacier, eventually you might get talked out of it. But if there's other people that say, oh yeah, and there was something about that glacier, that I just can't explain, but I know what you mean. Then you get it. Then you can make use of it. A psychedelic experience is more than your mind can handle. Okay? But you can recall that you were in a state where you could handle it. Then if you start reading, like mystical readings from almost any religious tradition, they all read the same. And people who've had psychedelics read that stuff and they say, oh yeah, I know what he's talking about. I know what she's talking about. And before, you don't.
Forgive how free associative this might feel, but when I think you're familiar. I was working in Malibu this summer, and I would go out pretty late from the studio, and there's a big population of coyotes in Malibu. And then when I would go outside, I would see all these bunnies running around, and it reminded me of video games where you're a wizard or something. You're playing this role in this game, and you're running around, and you have these little things to pick up and put in the pouch. And I was like, oh, they're in the game, and they have to catch these rabbits in their role in the game. And I think for some reason, psychedelic and other discoveries in this role that we play, these roles that we play, feel like those things we pick up and put in the pouch, or consume or whatever, that do what they do to us, in whatever those things are that we find on our way. One of my close friends is from the hardcore punk community, and he prides himself on being straight edge. He does drink coffee, but that's about it. And so when we talk about these things, it's no, I just want to use my brain as intended, as intended. even smoking a blunt, I'll feel like I'll be reminded of mortality and be terrified.
Yeah.
You know?
Well,
and yeah.
Well, but right at the edge of being terrified, right at the other side of that is, oh, it's only death. I've done that before. You know, Ram Dass, one of his last interviews before he died was, he was talking about dying, and he was saying, well, yeah, it's death, birth, death, birth. In my early research days, we had some people who were alcoholics. Couples sent by the courts, couples just came in. And what we saw is we would give them the same basic treatment, and we would give them, say, 400 micrograms of LSD, which makes most people really want to lie down. And at 400 micrograms, these guys would be walking around saying, hey man, I don't know what's going on, this kind of feels weird. So we found that with alcoholics, they were so used to handling an altered state that we had to give them more. So we gave them like 800, which is, I do not recommend. And they would have the same basic experience of letting go to themselves and seeing themselves in a larger way. And they would almost all come back and feel that their body really needed to be respected, and that their drinking wasn't working for their body. This is true of smoking as well. But almost all of them, within a week, would go out and get loaded. Okay?
Right.
And then they would come back to us and say, hey, what did you do to me? We said, well, we didn't do anything. We just gave you a psychedelic. You had your own experience. They said, but drinking doesn't feel good.
Right.
Because what they felt was they could feel the way your life shrinks when you drink. It doesn't get bigger. And I watched a film of a guy who 40 years ago, one of the last people before the government shut it down, was an alcoholic and went through a program in Spring Grove, Maryland. And he'd been a serious alcoholic. He was in his maybe early 30s. He was losing his wife. He was losing his job. His kids were mad at him. He was sick a lot, and he couldn't stop. But he had the psychedelic. He had this experience, and he stopped drinking. Now, the filmmaker says to him, have you ever, what's your drinking now? He says, I haven't drunk a drop in 40 years. And the filmmaker starts to ask him about his willpower. And the guy laughs. He says, it's not willpower. I lost interest in drinking. That's a different kind of letting go of an addiction. There's both some research published on chronic smokers. To get into the study, you had to have 20 years of 2 packs a day, and you tried a whole lot of treatments. So these were hardcore, couldn't stop smoking smokers. And of the first 12, 11 of them were abstinent, had stopped smoking for at least the first 6 months. And when they started to look at who did better and so forth, and who lasted longer, they found that the more clearly they had what was called a mystical experience, the more likely they were to have quit cold turkey and never looked back. And I had an early report of microdosing, which is not quite as hardcore, about 3 or 4 years, pack a day. But he said, I wanted to stop smoking, and I thought microdosing would help. So within about 2 microdoses, a couple of days apart, he noticed that he wasn't smoking. And he continued microdosing for other reasons. And I checked in with him. This was about 5 years ago. I checked in with him recently, and he had some interesting stories, but he'd never smoked since. So both microdosing, when you are clear with intention, and high doses for very, very, very serious cases seem to help people stop smoking. But again, these are all people who want to. U.S. culture kind of doesn't allow us much grief. There's a whole side of it, buck up. You're not dead. Get on with it. And that's really nuts. So that being allowed to grieve, and it's because your brother, you miss him. He's out of your life. Your mother feels much differently as only parents can. So if we're allowed to grieve, usually people get what they need from grieving, from allowing their feelings just to flow. But when you can't grieve, or you keep grieving what you feel is too long, then it may be helpful to get a different perspective. The question for me when someone says they want to take a psychedelic is a little bit like someone says, hey man, I want to be in a relationship. And I say, well, what kind of relationship and with who and how's it going to work and so forth, rather than, there's some guy in the corner who says, hey, I'll sell you a relationship. When you get benefit from a high dose psychedelic, ayahuasca or LSD or any of them, you stop. Because you need to make use of it, to integrate it, to get some benefit from it, to make your life better. And while you can't get addicted in the traditional sense of addictive drugs where you have to take more and more and more and you get less and less hit, you can become kind of habituated to, rather than solve your problems, is you'll just get high.
Indeed.
It's hard to misuse psychedelics, but hey, people are wonderfully creative.
Do you think it was just prudence or a conservative leaning set of ideals, or do you think it was, what do you think made the government stop?
Okay, well, it would be nice to have something nice to say at this point, but I don't. Because we actually know. We actually know because one of Nixon's close colleagues who went to jail, etc., said it very clearly. It was never about the drugs. Nixon declared the war on drugs because it was a way of getting at the people he hated, people who were against the war and people who were against him. And it was predominantly the hippies who were against the whole culture. And it was blacks. That was where the marijuana was most used. And it was a way where you could bust people for something that was either harmless or beneficial. And you didn't have to say what you were really after was breaking up their political social groups. Now what happened is, the medical people kind of went along with it and started to come up with all the reasons that it was dangerous. And it like everything else, misused, it was dangerous. I mean, there was this wonderful poster that the marijuana people used to use before things got so legal, where it would be causes of death, and the top of it would be like alcohol, and be 400,000 people a year, heart disease, so forth. And then as you went down, it'd be less and less and less. And way down at the bottom of the chart, 2 from the bottom, was deaths from peanuts, about 100 a year. And then below that was marijuana. Deaths from marijuana, 0. Okay?
Right.
So psychedelics, in spite of their incredibly powerful effect on your mental life, are curiously incredibly safe drugs. And there's this wild little little paper that came out where somebody reported on someone had taken not a microdose, but a full dose, only 5 times as much as you should take, and another person who'd had 50 times what you should take, and another person who had several thousand. They didn't do it on purpose. Now, all of these 3 people, first person just had a very weird time. The person with 50 was hospitalized for a few days, as was the person with several thousand. But they were hospitalized because they were pretty much out of it, comatose. They all physically recovered 100%. Now, here's the kicker. Here's the kicker on that one. The person with 50 and the person with a couple of thousand both had chronic mental illness. And in both cases, their chronic mental illness was alleviated, was basically healed. Now, nobody is recommending this, but it certainly is a strange kind of drug if taking a huge amount of it doesn't harm you.
What cures you of something.
Science.
Not a recommendation to take 1,000 times.
Yeah, no recommendations for that. No. Now let me go back to Nixon a moment, because there's one other piece. Schedule 1, as it's called in the federal rule book, are drugs that, quote, have no medical use and a high propensity for addiction, of which cocaine and heroin are obvious, and speed. Now, at the time it was put on Schedule 1, no medical use, it was LSD was the single most researched psychiatric drug in the world. When I became a researcher, as I talked to you earlier, as a graduate student, I wrote Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, who made LSD, and said in my kind of naive way, can you send me any information? And I got back 2 volumes, about 1,000 of the first 1,000 studies, and they only sent me the abstract, just the first page of each study. The fact is that it had escaped the universities, it had escaped the laboratories, it had escaped the medical world. People all over the country were taking LSD, and one of the main things they came up with is they didn't like war. They did like ecology. They did like racial justice. And the Nixon administration found a way to stop it. So much for science.
Are you a fan of putting LSD in chocolate?
Well, I confess, I don't think I've ever been asked that question. I do know a lot of people who put psilocybin mushrooms in chocolate, and part of it because mushrooms taste bad. No, I'm actually not, because with LSD, you're dealing in millions of a gram. It's hard to get what a millionth of a gram is. You can easily balance a millionth of a gram on the tip of a pin, okay? And It's important to know how much you're taking. Yeah, there was a New York Times reporter when edibles were just coming in, and she was in Denver, and she took, a square of a chocolate bar of marijuana edibles. And as people do, she didn't feel much, so she ate all of it. And she spent the next 8 hours lying on the floor of her hotel room, wondering if she was ever going to be willing to tell the story. So I'm perfectly happy with edibles, but I've noticed the labeling is getting clearer and clearer about, don't overdose. And with LSD, which is still illegal, I'd prefer that people would have it on a tab or piece of little blotter paper, so they have some idea how much they're taking and how to be more careful. Oh, legalization. Yeah, it's inevitable. The reason is not because we're seeing that it's helpful. That's helping. And now there's a lot of decent medical research. But what there is now is about 15 companies all racing into what is called now the psychedelic space. That's a business term. And they're all busy promising incredible payback for investing in their companies should LSD become legal. And they've all made big gains since they were on the market. A lot of them are penny stocks. And the fact is that the medical uses are very, very clear now. And it's hard to be a government that says, I really want to keep more people mentally ill. And even more, you don't, in the United States, you don't want to stand up and say, I don't mind that more soldiers have committed suicide since Iran and Afghanistan than we lost in the world wars. And that if there's a substance which would help vets not kill themselves, it's really hard for a politician to be against. So there's the forces of good, which is it can really help, particularly severe depression and post-traumatic stress. And there are companies who know how to make money. And they know how to get around, they're now lobbyists, pressuring the government towards legalization. So all of a sudden, and this is described in if you look in the kind of stock market literature, it's called the Wild West of psychedelic stocks. And I have no idea how it's going to come out. Worldwide, there's an awful lot of depression. Now, there's an awful lot of sorrow, meaning the world is tough, but there's depression on top of that. Antidepressants don't make you feel better. They make you feel less bad. And what a lot of people say is, yeah, they make you feel less bad, and it feels like I'm numb. Psychedelics work on depression totally differently. And people not only feel less bad, they feel more good. So yeah, legalization is inevitable, and it will not happen in the United States first. It's almost happening in Canada right now. And there are substances which turn into LSD in the body. They're kind of LSD with an extra molecule. And they're available over the internet legally, in much of Europe, much of Canada, etc. How will the rest of legalization roll out, and will the United States, catch up? One more possible loop, because I know who's listening. One of the things that we found, and we as my little research team, and we've got about 3,000 reports from 51 countries about microdosing, and a lot of those are depression. And that's where I know the most, and that microdosing is the safest, least dangerous, and you don't need a lot of professional help for depression.
The pharmaceuticals industry seems to be putting out some things that definitely have mixed reviews with everybody I've talked to about.
Mixed reviews is a nice way of saying it. Yeah, they're not worthless, but they're not very good. Kind of like going to a bad restaurant. You still get food. You saved yourself from, and this is a little strange, the depression that people get when they're on antidepressants. And it's that feeling of oh, well, just bad things happen. There's nothing you can do about it. Now, when you're not on an antidepressant, when bad things happen, you feel terrible, but you feel like doing something about it. It's a very great difference. Part of the reasons on this, I've spent the last 10 years looking at microdosing is the amazing shift. What people say after one or two microdoses is, I'm back. And I say, what do you mean? They say, I'm back, I'm me. I have feelings again.
Beautiful.
And when you have feelings, of course, you have bad feelings too. But it's kind of like, if someone said to you, hey, I've got this great musical instrument, it just has a lot less of a range. You don't have to worry about those high notes or those really low notes. We cut them off.
Yeah.
You say, well, wait a moment. Yeah, but you can play most things on it.
And it sounds great. It really does.
Well, they sound okay. kind of miss the highs and the lows. I am delighted to spend time with you, and who knows when we can all see each other in reality again, whether we'll finally meet.
You're listening to Blonde